Rodeo is a terrific sport. It's a shame to see anybody get hurt, but it happens to the men as well as the women. It's just that so far in this country we idolize and like to look after our women. We don't want to see them hurt.
Women have been a part of rodeo for more than 100 years, making a name for themselves in any way that they could. While the rodeo has featured many princesses, queens, and barrel racers, in its early years it featured women competing in what is now known as a male-dominated event, saddle bronc riding. But a 1929 tragedy would ban women from competing in rough stock events for almost 20 years. From 1919 to 1929, triumphant women took a large step in the rodeo arenas of the American West in order to gain equality and show that they could do what they loved and become an example for all women throughout the United States. Bonnie McCarroll and other women in rodeo were rejecting settling for being rodeo queens and instead became full participants in the sport by taking their place alongside men and riding rough stock animals. But the progress of women in rodeo was shattered by the tragic death of Bonnie McCarroll in 1929, which put a halt on women being able to compete alongside men in the rodeo arena, and dealing women's participation in all sports a large setback. In the years leading up to the founding of the Pendleton Roundup in 1910, women across the West were married at a young age, had children, and were often a little more than domestic laborers who cleaned and cooked. They were not independent and rarely had the ability to pursue their interests and dreams. But by the Roaring Twenties, some began taking part in adventurous pursuits. In 1920, Amelia Earhart took her first flight, and in the 1920 Summer Olympics, women competed for the first time. Then, in 1926, Gertrude Ederle swam the English Channel, besting the fastest men's time by 10 hours. This new attitude came from an expansion of entertainment for the masses and a desire to live while you can, partly as a reaction to the carnage that resulted from World War I. Individuals began to have more time for activities, and some women began participating in the national sports craze. What was true of the most popular women's sports was also true in the most unlikeliest place for women, the rodeo arena. Mary Ellen Treadwell, or Dot as she was known by her friends, found that she was able to pursue what she loved, riding broncs. Her journey began as a little girl, where she lived near High Valley, Idaho. She grew up on a cattle ranch, where she was able to assist in some of the more manly duties, such as tending to the horses, which also required riding them, and occasionally they would buck. In this ranching experience, Dot soon discovered a love for riding even the wildest of broncs. Dot would go on to become well known in the rodeo world by 1915, with her show name, Bonnie McCarroll. In 1915, an 18-year-old McCarroll participated in her first big rodeo in Pendleton, Oregon. She had mounted a horse by the name of Silver. As the bronc bucked and twisted, McCarroll was thrown high into the air, where she was photographed by photographer Walter S. Bowman. This image soon became an iconic rodeo photo, catching the eye of many around the world. This picture shows Bonnie being thrown off the wild horse about to land on her head. Despite the tumble, however, McCarroll ended up winning first place in the women's bronc riding event at the 6th Pendleton Roundup. Due to the attention she received after her victory in Pendleton, she went on to participate in many other high-profile rodeos, including the Cheyenne Frontier Days in Wyoming and the first ever rodeo held at Madison Square Garden in New York City, where she ended up winning twice. Not only that, but McCarroll was acclaimed international champion as part of a large group of star performers in London. She was even given the great honor of performing in front of the United States President at that time, Calvin Coolidge, in 1927 in the Black Hills of South Dakota. Throughout McCarroll's rodeo years, she performed in front of thousands of spectators, including even the King and Queen of England. By 1922, Bonnie was considered to be a brilliant rodeo performer who always left the audience in awe. In September of 1929, the 32-year-old McCarroll was contemplating retirement with her husband, rodeo steer wrestler Frank McCarroll, but yearned to do just one last ride. She decided to participate in the Pendleton Roundup, where it had all begun 14 years earlier. This time, McCarroll would be considered a contracted performer, which means she had to abide by the rules set in place by the Rodeo Association, which could vary depending on the rodeo. Since McCarroll would only be competing against 4 other women, the Rodeo Association mandated that all 4 girls ride with hobbled stirrups to even the playing field.
This is an example of how you hobble stirrups. This rope goes between the 2 stirrups but under the horse's belly. What that does for a rider, it allows you to ride a little ranker horse because your stirrups are tied down and now you can use them to help hold you on.
McCarroll was not familiar with this style of riding and had always ridden slick, which meant that she could rise and fall with each buck of the horse, rather than being stuck onto the saddle. She was said to have never ridden hobbled before, but because of the contract, she had to agree. On September 20th, Bonnie McCarroll mounted an agitated horse named Black Cat. Immediately after coming out of the chute, the horse fell forward and somersaulted. The horse then leaped up and began to buck. The traumatic fall had knocked Bonnie out cold, and due to the hobbled stirrups, wedged her left foot in the stirrup. The horse continued to leap 6 more times. Each time McCarroll's head was thrown and slammed onto the ground until finally her foot fell loose, ending the violence. McCarroll was rushed to the St. Anthony Hospital in Pendleton, where she would die 10 days later due to pneumonia and traumatic spinal injuries. McCarroll only woke once during her time at the hospital, where she murmured an unintelligible sentence, but then fell back into unconsciousness. On September 30th, news of Bonnie McCarroll's death appeared on the front page of the East Oregonian.
She did what she wanted to be doing, and she left a legacy that a lot of us aren't going to ever leave.
Despite this tragic end to a triumphant career, McCarroll's fearlessness inspired many others and demonstrated what women could do if given the opportunity. But her death meant something else to rodeo officials, including the directors at the Pendleton Roundup.
It was a great tragedy, and I think it occurred at a time when transition was already underway, and it was sort of like the last straw that broke the camel's back, that it was finished a process that was already underway. But I think, the tragedy, of course, was her death, but it was also, with her death, you lost a very, very colorful part of rodeo.
Within the next year, bronc riding for women would be banned in almost every other rodeo across the nation, including the famous rodeo at Madison Square Garden. Only 1 month after Bonnie's death in Pendleton, the stock market crash of 1929 rocked America. The Great Depression would go on and send the country into a state of economic devastation. The new and daring lives that women had fought so hard to build over the past decade were now being lost. Priority was given to men for jobs, and women were again expected to be the keepers of the home. Women's participation in athletics dipped, and in the rodeo, they were now forced out of one of the only ways that they could make a name for themselves and a little cash on the side. Despite the efforts of McCarroll and other cowgirls who had pushed so hard to be seen as equals, women were relegated back to feminine roles in this sport. This colorful part of rodeo would not be seen again until 1948, when the Women's Professional Rodeo Association was created, but didn't attract many women until 1979, when women began to assert their place not only in the rodeo arena, but also in society. Although Bonnie McCarroll's death convinced rodeo officials to ban bronc riding for women, the strength and courage she displayed as she competed over the years showed many women that they could make a name for themselves in arenas outside of rodeo. McCarroll stands as an inspiring figure, encouraging women to do more with their lives, and this continues to shape our society today. And in the world of rodeo, women can once again hope to expand their traditional roles in this sport. And while it has not become a sanctioned event at the big rodeos, some cowgirls are now hoping to be able to compete at Pendleton for the first time since 1929. They long to have the opportunities that Bonnie McCarroll seized and honor the early cowgirls' legacies.
In the words of Letterbuck in the Pendleton Roundup, for me, I believe those words mean to follow your dreams, always be true to yourself, and know that all your possibilities in life are limitless.